I decided that for this year I was going to talk about something that has always troubled me about the Haggadah. There are certain elements of the Haggadah that are fairly straightforward, and you can do whatever you want with, and you're going to be okay. You can talk about the Abrabanim, the 4 children, ad infinitum. You can talk about, is Moshe the Shaliach, is he the emissary of God, or is he the emissary of the Jews? Like there are easy things in the Haggadah to talk about. And then on the other hand, there's the section that I picked for today, which I really never understood, and it's the math segment.
That's my husband's a mathematician.
Yes.
And every year at Pesach, he bores us to death because he's absolutely fascinated with this, and he goes through all of these things and talks about the numbers and the whole thing. And most of us say, wow. Who cares?
Right, and I think that's a legitimate question. Well, we have one saying, who cares, and another one saying it's her favorite part.
Every year at the Haggadah, I explain it to everyone in the family, because it's the whole math section. You have to multiply it by this.
Right.
Figure it out, and how is it, so no one else understands. The kids don't understand.
My husband does.
Right.
Well, I don't really understand it.
I don't either. We all sit there, sometimes not so patiently, waiting for him to go through his whole numerical analysis of the situation.
Right.
Well, I should just point out that when Rabbi Truffler gave a share on making the Haggadah children kid-friendly, he said that if they're getting antsy and like running around the table by this time, you can skip it.
There you go. And I think that says it all. That's part of the who cares camp, I think. And really, when you look at this, it comes at such an odd part within the Haggadah. And meaning that you just finished talking about the 10 makos, right? The 10 plagues, and that we get. That's a critical part of the story. And then we're going to go on to Dayenu and thanking Hashem for every step of what he did in the beginning of Hallel. And then you're going to have, of course, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, and you have to say these 3 things. Those are key. And then in the middle, we have this section with 10 and 50 and 40 and 200 and what is this? Let's read it first of all in order to know, refresh our memories of what we're talking about, particularly because I suspect that 1 or 2 of us, here at the table end up using this opportunity to duck into the kitchen and make sure that Shulchan Aruch is in progress. So that, it may not be that familiar. Yeah, so it may not be that familiar. So let's take a look at what's actually here. I brought you the Hebrew and the English in source number 1. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is the first of 3 sages to comment on the plagues that strike the Egyptians in Egypt and at the sea. And he says, Minayin ata omer shalaku ha-mitzrim b'mitzrayim eser makos. How do you know that the Egyptians were struck with 10 plagues in Egypt, val hayam laku chamishim makos, and 50 upon the sea? He's not really asking about the 10 in Egypt. He's taking it as a given that you read the previous section, which said that there were 10 plagues, and that you already know. The question is, how do you know that there are 50 at the sea? So he says, look, b'mitzrayim mahu omer, vayamru achartumim el paro, etzba elokim hi. In Egypt, it says, the Chartumim said to Paro, this is the finger of God. And the Chartumim are describing, we're assuming, the plagues as a whole. So the 10 plagues are the finger of God. Valhayam mahu omer, and what does it say at the sea? Vayar Yisrael as hayara chazaka asher asa Hashem b'mitzrayim, that Israel saw the mighty hand of God in Egypt. And he continues with the rest of the pasuk. Vayira'u ha'ames Hashem, they were in awe of God, they revered God, they feared God. Even we'll have to talk about the translation of fear a little bit later. Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo, and they trusted in God and they trusted in Moshe his servant. So went from a finger to a hand. Kama laku be'etzba, right? How many with the finger? 10. So therefore, at the sea, it's 50. That's the first stage. That's the first stage of the math. We go from 10 to 50. Then you get the second one, and Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer says, wait, actually, each plague that the Egyptians are struck with, both in Egypt and at the sea, is made of 4 parts. Why? He quotes you a pasuk in a Tehillim. The pasuk is part of Perek Ayin Chet, chapter 78, which in general talks about what happened in the rescue of the Jews from Egypt. So he's not just pulling a sentence in a vacuum, but he's pulling a sentence from a chapter of Tehillim that talks about the punishment God brought on the Egyptians. And the pasuk says, Yishalach bam charon apo, he sent upon them. Don't be thrown off by the word yishalach, which sounds to people like future tense. It's not. He sent upon them charon apo, the ferocity of his anger, which the ferocity is expressed as Evra, Za'am, Tsara, and Mishlachat Malachei Ra'im. I chose not to translate Evra, Za'am, and Tsara here. Evra is a form of anger, but so is Za'am. So what you'll see often in the translations are two different words for anger and rage, or something like that. I feel like it's an injustice to it. If you don't know what you're talking about, just write the words in italics, and better to do that. These are two different forms of anger. And then Tsara is pain. And Mishlachat Malachei Ra'im, and the harmful angels, a group of harmful angels. So those are my 4 things. So I'm going to count each one as an independent plague, and therefore, even though you thought the Egyptians were only hit 10 times in Egypt, Dam was actually 4 plagues, Svardeya was 4 plagues, and so on down through. I watched a couple of clips from the 10 Commandments last night, because we have a Shabbaton this Shabbos at Shari Shamayim, and our theme is liberty, and so we're doing, for the drasha, we're doing sheer theater. It's something that we do from time to time for our programs. Elaine has seen it. So we're doing it there, and it's on the theme of liberty, and we're weaving in certain elements from the 10 Commandments into it. So now I'm in the mood for this, the plagues and all that. I'm picturing Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. And each of these plagues is actually 4-fold, so therefore the 10 times 4 is 40. And therefore at the sea, since what happens at the sea is 5 times what happens in Egypt, it's 200. And then Rabbi Akiva says, wait, you had ferocity of his anger as a preface before Evra, Za'am, Tsara, and the angels. Really, ferocity of his anger is part of what God sent against the Egyptians, and therefore each plague is really 5-fold. Ferocity of his anger, Evra, Za'am, Tsara, and these angels. And therefore it's 5-fold each plague, and therefore it's 50 in Egypt, and therefore it is going to be 250 at the sea, because it's 5-fold. Does everyone get that? I mean, that's all clear.
That's
okay?
all the mathematics, yeah.
Okay, we've now gone through the math. And still the question is, who cares? I have 3 questions. Number 1, what does this add to the Haggadah's telling, or are we just free associating? Like, it's interesting to note that there's a parak in Tehillim that happens to deal with getting out of Egypt, and it describes 5 different terms for divine wrath, and therefore we're going to show you how you can multiply things. That's number 1. Number 2, what does it mean to say that there were 4 or 5 or 200 plagues? Dam, right? Blood. We know what that was. The water turned to blood. How does that turn into 4 plagues or 5 plagues? What are you actually talking about? Are they hit harder in some way? Are these different aspects of it? That's number 2. And then number 3, most important to me as a parent, I can, as I said at the outset, learn pedagogic lessons from parts of the Haggadah. Right? I can learn about Arba Banim and dealing with each child in his own way. I can deal with Dayenu and how it's important not just to express gratitude for the whole, but actually for each aspect of what happened. Actually, I use that with my kids, because now that I'm not in the shul rabbinate anymore, so we get to go to my parents for Pesach. So on the ride back from New York, I tell the kids, you're going to thank my parents. You're going to, write out some note. Do it like Dayenu. Break it down into the different things that they did. Don't just thank them for it. And they do it. They're great. They come up with all the different things, the ways in which things were done.
I think it's your wife that should be writing out the
I should tell my grandchildren to do that.
It actually works out really nicely.
For what she doesn't have to do at home.
So, try packing up kids for 2 weeks and taking them out. We made Pesach for 12 years, from the time we first got married until the time I moved to Toronto. I know the work involved in making Pesach, and I know the work involved in the trip, and it's closer than you would believe. But in any case,
For you, but not for your wife.
no.
Sure, it's time for her too.
No. But in terms of the lessons you can get, like what does this how does this somehow tie into V'higadata levincha, telling our children about the experience of leaving Mitzrayim? What exactly are we doing for them with this? I forgot. I realized I have a page here. I always like to get people to sign in preferably with an email address if possible, so I can follow up afterwards. Inevitably, thoughts occur to me after the class, and I like to be able to send them around. So if I could just have people sign in with an email address, unless you have it already, unless you have everybody registered already, in which case they don't have to do this. You can send me the list. That works too.
No,
Whatever. All right, sign in. Okay.
That's fine.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So these are our 3 questions. So the first item to realize is that this source that we use in the Haggadah actually appears in several different places in rabbinic writings, in Gemara and in Midrash. It was clearly popular and known historically. It's not something that comes into existence for the sake of the Haggadah. We have 4 different versions of it, all very similar. One appears in the body of Midrash called Shmot Rabbah, which tends to be Aggadic, sort of story-oriented Midrash on the book of Shmot. And there it's much like what we have here, except that it's Rabbi Yehoshua who gives the first view instead of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and Rabbi Akiva does not appear at all. You don't have the 250. The third option isn't there. Another version appears in a halachic Midrash called Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, and in that version it's the same as what we have here. A third version of it appears basically the same in another version of Mechilta, and then the Midrash on Tehillim, on this chapter in Tehillim, has it there as well. A couple of interesting variations. The Midrash in Shmot Rabbah ties this into Eov. Job being struck by God's hand also makes it into here, and how God strikes Job the way he struck the Egyptians, and makes all sorts of interesting associations between the 78th chapter in Tehillim in Psalms. Also, the Midrash on Tehillim, when it tells us, adds in Greek for the multiplications. It uses the term tetragon and pentagon to describe the way that it's 4 for this one and it's 5 for that one, and that'll liven up your Seder, Greek at the Seder. That confuse your holidays, though, with Hanukkah. But I want to address the second question first. The second question was, what does it mean when you say that there were 4 versions of this, or 5? What do you imagine when you read the Haggadah? What do you imagine it means when it says 4 times or 5 times?
Each plague, you mean?
Are you asking?
Yeah. Yeah, it's your turn.
Just, even though it's blood, but maybe it's, you think, okay, they suffered more than you would think they suffered, maybe, or maybe there was additional suffering, or maybe it's just a term. Maybe it's not really 4 times. Maybe it's just, an exaggeration of just how severe it was.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a possibility.
Maybe it affected them in 4 different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Could be.
I'm not quite sure how you...
I mean, you'd have to now map that across all the plagues, right? And then what do you do once you get to the sea?
Well, what did they suffer at the sea? What are the plagues that they just died?
They
Right.
drowned.
Well, you tell me.
They
I mean,
drowned.
drowning counts.
Okay, 50, but I'm saying, what is the 50?
That's one
Yeah.
plague. That's not 50.
Right. I mean, you could note, and we're going to come back to this in a little bit, that in Az Yashir, they're described as drowning in different
Yeah.
ways. How many different images are used in Az Yashir for the drowning? Do you remember? The Song at the Sea describes them with 3 different images. You have to get past the opening line.
I remember Susara.
Yeah, Susara.
No, but the three different allegories are used, or metaphors really. One, they're described as being thrown around like straw. In another one, they're described as sinking like a stone. And then in a third one, they're described as sinking like lead.
Yeah, not much difference.
Anyone ever hear of a difference between those 3? There is a difference.
Well, straw is the lightest.
Right.
Yeah. And
Is
lead
it better
the
to be
heaviest.
straw, stone, or lead?
The heaviest.
Lead.
Well,
Right?
lead is
It just
faster.
ends quickly
Lead
and
is
that's it.
faster. Yeah.
As opposed to
Right.
suffering, straw, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Straw is sort of like being on a carnival cruise. Sorry. the
Pesach, Costa Rica didn't hire you for their Pesach.
No. The image of the straw and the stone and the lead, I'm going to come back to that, but there are different experiences. The straw you just noted being tossed around on the water versus the stone that sinks, and then the lead that presumably sinks fastest. Take a look at source number 2, please. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was the last head of the Volozhin Yeshiva. And that puts him basically the end of the 19th century, very beginning of the 20th century. And he wrote prolifically.
Anything of Reb Meir Berlin?
So actually, it's an interesting story. He had two sons. One of them, Rav Meir Berlin, who became Meir Bar Ilan,
Right.
and the other Rav Chaim Berlin.
Oh, from the New York Yeshiva.
The one from the New York Yeshiva. So yes, as an outgrowth of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, you get Yeshivas Chaim Berlin and Bar Ilan University.
Right.
It's a very there's a lot to be said about that at another time. But he wrote prolifically, and one of his big works that's he's writing where no one else is writing, and therefore he provides a lot of insight for us, is on the Mechilta. The Mechilta is halachic medrash. Remember that medrash should not be assumed to be the nice stories that your children may see, your grandchildren may see, and the little medrash says. Medrash is the way that the rabbis analyzed verses that appear in the Torah and understood lessons from those verses, lessons which could be stories, could be moral instruction, and could be halacha. These are all called drashot. Drash being the method of producing medrash. So there is medrash halacha, Midrash that produces the laws that we know, and Mechilta is the name for the Midrash Halacha 2, the book of Shemot, but the passage that we're about to see, which is in Mechilta, is actually a story Midrash. It's not a halachic Midrash. So this is source number 2. Thank you. Higia lachol echad mirodfei Yisrael mitam meshuna. I'm going to go back and forth between Sephardic and Ashkenazic pronunciation. Basically. But what he writes is, this is his comment on the Mechilta. The Mechilta text I mentioned before is roughly the same as what you saw in source number 1 from our Haggadah. So he says, each of those who pursued Israel met Mitam Meshuna, also known in Yiddish as Misa Meshuna, right? It's a phrase that's used in Yiddish. That's Misa Meshuna. An abnormal or unusual death, according to his deeds, according to the way that he harmed Israel when they lived among the Egyptians. And that's what we mean when we say in the brachos leading up to Shema, it means at Mariv, the brachos that surround Shema, es rodfeihem v'es sonehem b'shamos tiba. The phrase in the davening is that God drowned their pursuers and enemies. So normally people read that phrase very quickly and then they go right on and they don't think about what it means. Why are you describing the Egyptians as pursuers and enemies? And if you were to ask your random person who davened Mariv what they meant, they would look at the siddur and say, I guess it just means because they were pursuers and they were our enemies. It's poetic. But the Netziv says it's not just poetic. He says we're meant to understand different things from the two words. He says, Hainu chel hamalucha nikreu rodfeihem shalom misin'a asu ela ba'avodat hamalucha. I retyped this, and therefore it should be ba'avodat. It should be ba'avodat. It's my mistake. He says the forces of the king are called the pursuers. They didn't pursue us out of hatred. They pursued us because that was their job, right? They showed up for work that morning and they were told by their commanding officer, today you're going to pursue the Jews. As far as they were concerned, they could have just as easily been attacking somebody else. They could have been on maneuvers. Doesn't make a difference. But the rest of the Egyptians who are pursuing them are the ones who are our enemies. They hate us. They pursued us for fun. They pursued us because they were angry that we were leaving. They pursued us in order to harm us. So there were actually two different groups. And who, of course, is the more guilty of the two? The ones who hate us, the Sonim. Those are the ones who are really bad. The other ones, God may have to put an end to them because otherwise they're going to kill us. But he's not going to look to punish them in the way that he's going to punish the others. And therefore, we're saying God punished the Rodfim and he punished the Sonim. He punished both of them, and so it continues. Umish nischayev al pi rish'o nitba, v'gam meit b'ashgacha v'mita ru'uya le'onsho. One who was liable for wickedness was drowned, but he also died with a particular punishment, something that was appropriate for him. And the Netziv says that is what's going on when we say that they were hit 4 times, they were hit 5 times, they were 50 times, whatever it is. It's not that an individual suffered 4 times or 50 times, but it's that there were this many varieties of punishment employed in order to make sure that each person got what was coming to him. That divine punishment is not a one-size-fits-all. Everyone's going to suffer the same fate. But rather, each person is met with whatever's appropriate for his deeds as judged by God. That's the way that the Netziv looks at it. That fits very well with source number 3. Midrash from Shemot Rabbah that deals with what happened at the sea. This Midrash quotes the passage that we see in our Haggadah with some variation, but it begins the section by saying, Hahu dichtiv noda Hashem mishpat asai. He quotes a pasuk from Tehillim, which says, God is known, He has performed justice. And the Midrash says, Medaber b'Mitzrayim, Sha'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'hem mishpatim b'Mitzrayim v'al hayam. It's talking about Egypt, because God performed justice for them in Egypt and upon the sea. Then in the part that I brought in the ellipsis, the part there is the 50 and the 200. And then it concludes, Have mishpat asa. This, the multiplication of the plagues, was God performing justice. That's the idea, is that it wasn't simply one size fits all. If God were to have stopped them simply by drowning them all in the sea, that wouldn't have been justice. It would have been protection of the Jews. But there's no justice involved, because maybe they didn't deserve it.
Why isn't that justice?
Because maybe it's not what they deserved. How do we know that?
Well, they were all rodfim.
Yeah.
Some did it because they were told.
And a rodef you're allowed to kill.
Yeah, but that's not justice.
That's
The fact that I'm allowed to kill a rodef, someone who's pursuing me, in order to save my life, not because he necessarily deserves.
This is exactly what it was. It is
Right.
justice. Of course, that's justice.
Why?
Because it was a just thing to have happened. That Hashem was protecting Bnei Israel by destroying the pursuers, the rodfim.
If someone is, God forbid, if someone is pursuing me, and I have a gun, then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to shoot him. If someone is pursuing me and I have a flamethrower, then I'm going to use the flamethrower. If someone, I don't stop and think, what does he deserve? Is this too much? My action is not meant to mete out justice to him. My action is meant to save my life. That's not justice. Justice means you did this and you get what you deserve for good or for bad.
It is that.
I mean, it's. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's you're supposed to protect yourself, but but justice involves evaluating someone's state and saying, I'm going to do something that suits who that person is, who that person has been. That's the idea. When I think of justice, of mishpat, I think of what happens in a Beit Din. What happens in a court where they can evaluate and say, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and this is what he deserves. Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's exactly his point, is that God makes that evaluation at the sea. It's not simply mass destruction. It's each one meeting the fate that was appropriate for who that person was. That's what the Netziv sees.
I mean, it would make sense that would be the case, because in every other case, it never seems like that God is being fair.
What?
I mean, to be honest with you, in all the other situations, it seems like good people die. No, good people die for no reason. Bad people live a long time for no reason. It never looks in the world like God is really meting out justice. And some people, good people die young. Old people, there are a lot of bad old people. My point, I'm just trying. You know, you could be a mafioso and live to be 90 years old.
Yeah.
My point is that the suffering that we see generally is not with justice. So maybe the point here is that at the sea there was justice, that this was different.
Or the idea, I would just tweak it with one word, there was visible justice.
Oh, okay.
In other words, the point is, I don't perceive it.
Right.
I don't perceive what's happening day to day.
Yes.
Here you could actually see it.
That's
We
true.
also often say we don't know the reason and we don't see it, and things,
Yeah.
in this world aren't always apparent to us, right?
Right.
Why the young person dies, why the old bad person lives, right? But now all of a sudden it's showing us.
And that's what the Midrash picks up
Like,
on.
almost
Noda Hashem
tit for
mishpat.
tat, like
Right.
getting what you deserve.
Right. This is now visible justice. That's the in the book of Eov, when he is suffering and he just declares, look, this is all just preordained, and it doesn't have to do with who I've been and what I've done. This is just, I'm suffering at the hand of the universe. And his friends try to counsel him, and one says, well, it's not really that. It's because what looks bad now will really be good. Or you may have been good, but you didn't live up to your potential, and you could have done more good. Or you'll get your reward in the next one. When they give them these responses, which are inherently unsatisfying, right? You say, that's because, like, you look at it and say, well, that's easy thing to say to somebody else. It's not an easy thing to absorb and apply for oneself.
It's a very problematic book in the Torah.
Well, that's exactly the point, though.
Yeah.
The point of the book, well, I would not have the hubris to say this is the point of the book, but one of the lessons that is drawn from this book is that there's a way to comfort and there's a way not to comfort. And what they try to do is ultimately very unsatisfying to him. And that's why it takes 40-something chapters to go through it's not like he hears it and says, oh, I feel better now. But in terms of this is God saying, okay, now you're going to see. Now you're going to see that, in fact, people meet a fate that is suited for what they've done. And take a look now at source number 4, where the Midrash speaks to the division I mentioned earlier with the straw and the stone and the lead. I brought you the version of it in one version of the Mechilta. Yordubim tzalot kamo aven, they descended in the depths like stone. Zukas benonis shebahen ksherim shebahen mitarfin kakash. Zukas benonis. That was the intermediate group. Was the one that was like stone. Or I should say, Zokas benonis shebahen would be the correct way to read it. They're intermediate. Well, I don't know if lo tov v'lo ra, but they're intermediate among a bad group.
We're not that.
Right. The Zokas benonis shebahen. Ksherim shebahen mitarfin kikash. The ones who were good among them were thrown about as straw.
Ooh, that's kind of the opposite of what we said before.
Beinoniim, the intermediate ke'even, are like stone, and Risha'im salu ka'oferet, the wicked sank like lead.
That's the opposite.
The opposite. And not only that, it's the opposite of Rashi.
Okay.
Interestingly, Rashi and elsewhere in Midrash, they have the opposite, where the righteous sink quickly.
Quickly, yeah.
But it seems that this version of the Midrash is saying that, well, surviving longer, even with pain, is better. Which is a very interesting perspective. I don't think most people would vote for this version, but that's the statement.
Not if the end is the same.
And take a look now at source number 5, right? Take a look at source number 5, where we find now the introductory line that the Midrash uses in one place for the passage in the Haggadah. Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim mate. Israel saw Egypt dead. And the Midrash says, Misos mishunos, abnormal deaths. Misos chamuros zumizu, each death harsher than the next. Lefishahevi aleim kama misos or makos bayam, he brought many deaths upon them at the sea. The word makos is the Vilna Gaon's edition. So what we've seen in this collection of sources from 2 through 5 is that the idea of multiple makos is that each one actually suffered in a way that was appropriate for his crime. The Midrash says that's what the mishpat was. That was the justice that was visible. It's played out a little bit in Az Yashir with the description of some sinking one way and some being thrown around and so on. And it fits with with the statement in the Midrash about the abnormal deaths. The Nitziv is not making up this idea. He's basing it on what he has found in the Midrash. But now flip the page. Because the Nitziv uses this to answer particular questions that one might have had about the story, about this passage in the Haggadah. He says, first of all, Ve'i efshar lefarish. I'm sorry, not about the Haggadah, but about the story in the Torah. Ve'i efshar lefarish ro hanes sha'asa b'kriyas hayam. He says, if you look at the psukim that describe what happens at the sea, it says that they saw. And they had awe of God, or they had fear, really, of God. So he says, what was it that the Jews saw? It says, Vayar Yisrael es hayad hagdolah. It says, Israel saw the mighty hand. Oh, what does that mean, Israel saw the mighty hand? What does that mean? So he says, he says you can't explain that it means that they saw the miracle of splitting the sea. Why? Because the pasuk says Israel saw the mighty hand that God did to Egypt. The splitting of the sea wasn't for Egypt's sake, it was for our sake. It was to save us. Splitting the sea, the point was that we would go through, not that they would perish. That was a byproduct. The Visu, and further, he says, the Torah says they saw and they were afraid of God. They feared God. And here I come back to the point I mentioned for a moment in the beginning. The word yirah, as it's used in the Torah, has multiple possible meanings. Sometimes yirah means awe, reverence. Sometimes yirah means fear. When we talk about, for example, ish imo ve'aviv tira'u, right? That doesn't mean fear your parent. It means you revere, right? The examples that the Gemara gives for what yirah are like, halavai, don't contradict them, right? It's a goal. It's a goal. They don't contradict them. Don't sit in their seat. These are not fear motivated. They're reverence. It's supposed to be. Again, we try. We try towards our own parents, and our children try towards us. It's an ongoing. It's a work in progress.
Very trying.
Yes, very trying. Exactly.
So, excuse me, sir. When they say seeing and fearing, is it Bnei Israel or the Egyptians who are fearing?
It says in the Torah that the Jews did.
Yeah.
The Vayire'u ha'amet Hashem is the expression of the pasuk. So when we talk about Yirat Hashem, sometimes it means awe and reverence, but sometimes it means fear. And in this case, as the Netziv understands it, it's fear. And he says, I don't understand. You just saw God split the sea and take you through and punish your enemies. What are you afraid of? Just the opposite. God has now shown He's your best friend. You should be thrilled. So he says, I don't understand that. And then third, he says, the gam mazen ispalu ata bekriyas yamsuf yoser miyitzias mitzrayim bepela. He says, I don't understand. You saw 10 plagues in Egypt. That didn't impress you? Now you see this at the sea, and now you're suddenly in awe. What was it about what happened here that was that impressive? And so the Netziv says, now you understand. It's not seeing the splitting of the sea. It's seeing the way that God tailored what He did for each Egyptian to what the Egyptian had done. So to go back to the Netziv's 3 questions. Number 1. It emphasizes what God did to Egypt, because that's what they saw. The way that each one met a particular... You knew that Egyptian was your neighbor, and you knew what he had done and what he had not done, and you saw how he was disposed of ultimately in a way that suited his conduct. It leads to yirah, it leads to fear, because you think to yourself, well, that could be me, because I know who I've been, and I wonder now where I'm going. And it's why they only believe now. Because, and this is a key point, the faith in God, and I didn't intend this for the pun, but emunah, comes from seeing that God will mete out justice to those who deserve it. It's more than just saying, well, there was a God who created the world once. It's that there's a God who's paying attention now, who sees what's going on and is going to do something about it. Which, as Dahlia said, frankly, is rare. We don't normally see it in the world, and frankly, we often see it inappropriately. Right? For all the times when something happens and a person says, aha, they got what they had coming to them, like you have any clue what they had coming to them. And of course the worst of them, the evangelical, declaration of there was an earthquake and a hurricane and a this and a that, because, come on. We're very bad at actually understanding what's going on and assigning the guilt or the credit. But when you see this scene in which God shows you each one's getting that which was appropriate, that's what brings about emunah. That's what brings about a certain faith. So that if you take a look, I brought you source number 7. The Gemara in Zvachim is bothered by Yisro. Yisro, the Torah says, heard something and came to join the Jews. It's the beginning of Parshat Yisro. It says, Vayishma Yitro chotein Moshe. Is kol asher asa Elokim leMoshe u'Yisrael amo. It says Yisro heard everything that God had done for Moshe and for Israel, his nation, ki yotzi Hashem es Yisrael miMitzrayim, because God had brought them out of Egypt. So the Midrash asks, the Gemara asks, what is it that Yisro heard in particular? Just in general, Jews are no longer in Egypt. What was it that so impressed him?
God.
Well, take a look at what the Gemara does with it. Rabbi Yeshua says it was the war with Amalek. Rabbi Lazar Hamodai says it was the giving of the Torah. There's some debate as to whether Yitro shows up before or after the presentation of the Torah. The chronology is awkward because on the one hand, it's listed before the Torah is given. On the other hand, he tells Moshe that you're spending too much time judging the people. You should appoint judges. What judges?
Laws. Yeah.
Right, what laws? There are no laws yet. But if you're going to tell me it's after the giving of the Torah, that creates its own problem because he shows up with Tzipora, Moshe's wife, and Moshe's two sons.
Right.
To think that they weren't there when the Torah was given, that Moshe's own family doesn't witness it is difficult. True. So that's part of the question, but he's taking the view. Rabbi Elazar Amodai is taking the view that it's after the Torah was given, and Rabbi Eliezer says it's Kriyas Yamsuf, it's the splitting of the sea that impresses Yisro. Why would that be? Because that's the pasuk there says Ki vadavar asher zadu aleihem, which are those are awkward words. How do you translate those words? The Midrash explains, he saw that the Egyptians were punished with what they had visited upon the Jews. The punishment fits the crime. And that's what impresses Yisro, which makes a lot of sense. I once heard a shir, actually, you have a chance to hear him. Those are in Thornhill. Rav Mendel Blachman from Karen B'Yavne is going to be in Thornhill March 16th. So I remember hearing a shir from him 20 years ago in Karen B'Yavne where he talked about what impressed Yisro. And he said, remember, Yisro comes from a society in which you have multiple gods. So he was the Kohen Midian. He's the priest in Midian. And you have a god. And let's say you worship the god, you brought your sacrifice, and your crops didn't turn out well that year. So the next year you added another one. There was no notion of holding the god responsible, so to speak, and saying, if it doesn't work out, then now I'm trying something else. And Yitro is a seeker. He doesn't like that. And so he goes looking for what is true, and ultimately this impresses him. There's a certain divine accountability, which, frankly, we would like to see also. But that's what impresses him. Yeah, sure.
What does it say? I know there are different versions of if he really leave Gayer. He converted. He does go back to Midian. He doesn't stay with them.
Right.
He goes back.
Good.
Okay, and secondly, if you look later on in the Torah, his descendants, like the Canaim, right? The Canaanites? Canis, or whatever they're called. They're told to leave when they're going to attack Amalek, I think, to save them. Well, if they were Jewish already, all the descendants, they'd be amongst Bnei Israel, not amongst Amalek.
Correct. So this really bothered me. Sorry, yeah.
Isn't it that he learned to believe in one divine God?
Maybe.
So this bothered me a great deal when I started translating the source for the source sheet, because the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of debate as to what happens with Yitro. Here he's with the Jews. In Parshas Ba'aloscha, a year later, when they leave Har Sinai, Moshe says to Yisro, please stay with us. It's been good for us having you, and you are a pair of eyes for us in the wilderness. Why Moshe needs a pair of eyes when he has, God guiding them, I don't know. Maybe it has to do with what's going to happen in the next 40 years. But it's odd to see Yitro leaving if he's converting. And then some suggest, well, he went home to convert his family. All sorts of different explanations are given. Okay. The ArtScroll didn't invent it, but the problem of what happens in Shmuel, where they are described indeed living among Amalek, does lead some to suggest that he doesn't convert. The problem is, then what was he doing, showing up there and bringing offerings and so on, if he wasn't converting? And why wouldn't he convert? If he believes in everything now and he's bringing his offerings, why wouldn't he join? It's not easy and simple, this question of what Yisro's fate is. We also see Yitro and his descendants juxtaposed with Amalek a few times in Tanakh. Clearly, the end of Parshat Beshalach, beginning of Parshat Yitro is one. Another one is the war with Amalek under Shaul in the 16th chapter in Shmuel. But we find it a few times in Tanakh, this juxtaposition of the Cani and Amalek, contrasting Amalek, who heard about God and attacked, and Yitro, who heard about God and came to at least bring offerings, if not actually convert.
But We
But
have
yeah,
the
this view here is that he
concept
converted.
now of the righteous Gentile, right?
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't he have been a righteous Gentile?
Yep, absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
100%.
I mean, every indication, the way he took Moshe in, the way he allowed him to go back to Egypt and gave him a blessing before he left, all indicate to me he was a very decent human being.
Yeah, no, I think we're agreed. We like Yitro.
Yeah.
He's on the good
guy.
list.
Well, he wouldn't have been in the section with Aseret Dibro if he weren't.
But you know, Christian people name their kid Jethro. It's not a typical
Not too many,
name.
though. Not too many. I think you have to be of the Beverly
I
Hillbillies.
know one Jew-
Or a band. You have to have a band.
I know one Jewish Yitro. I know
In
one
certain
Jewish
cultures
one.
probably do use the name more than others. That's,
Yeah, but Jewish people don't name their
I
kids
know one
Yitro.
religious Jew
Right.
named Yitro.
Yeah, really?
Hmm He lives in Israel now, but he was born in Germany at the time of when 1938 or 39, the family was still there,
Mhm.
and they had a selection of names you could name Jewish children that you were allowed to in Germany, like Abraham, Isaac,
Right.
Jacob.
They wanted easy identification.
So they had Jethro on there for some crazy reason. So they wanted the least sounding Jewish name. So they named him Yitro. Eventually moved to New Jersey after being during the war in, of all places, Spain.
Hmm.
Spain?
Yeah. Wow.
Because they were allowed kosher food by Franco,
Hmm.
who turns out that he was a
Yeah.
converso.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
The yeah, I guess that way also. If people asked him if he was Jewish, he would say, "No, I'm Midianite." Okay.
Right.
So, taking this idea now that the Netziv builds up, the idea that the 4 and the 5 and so on are meant to really indicate unique punishments for each one, that explains to me why it's recorded at this spot in the Haggadah. It's right after the Makos. Right after we do Dam Tzvardea, Kinim Arov, and then the
We only dip out
acronym.
once.
Depends on your minhag.
Right.
Depends on your minhag. Oh, that? Yes.
yeah.
I haven't seen anyone do 4 for each plate.
No.
So
Or
that
pour the whole
adds
bottle out.
that adds a lot here because the central element of the Makos is that personal justice. That's the central element of the plagues. We just listed the plagues, but we want you to understand the central element, seen already in Egypt with the 10, but amplified much more at the sea, is this personal justice that meets each one. That's a key component of what we read about in the Haggadah, which can help satisfy a problem in the Rambam. And this I'll just do briefly. I really like this point. The Rambam's Haggadah appears at the end of Hilchos Chametz Umatzah in his Mishnah Torah, his work of law. And his Haggadah omits this section. So not only did Rabbi Strauchler tell you that, if the kids are getting antsy, you can skip this, the Rambam skipped it. Why does the Rambam skip it? So take a look at source number 8. I wouldn't want to skip it. I'm sorry. Take a look at source number 8. The Rambam writes, Mitzvahs aseh shel Torah, there is a biblical mitzvah, L'saper benisim v'niflaos shanasu lavosenu b'mitzrayim b'leil chamisha asar b'nisan, to speak of the miracles and wonders that were performed for our ancestors in Egypt. Now, the mitzvah is to tell this story, b'leil chamisha asar b'nisan, to tell it on the night of the 15th of Nisan, meaning the comma has to be after the word b'mitzrayim. He's not saying tell what happened on the 15th. He's saying tell what happened on the 15th. And you know that because as you read the rest of the Rambam, which I didn't bring on the sheet, he asks how do you know it should be on the 15th and so on. And then he quotes the pasuk, Shneamar, Zachor hayom hazeh asher yitzasem mitzrayim, remember this day when you left Egypt. But the point is, Herschel Schechter writes in an article in a journal called Mesorah, the 3rd volume of it, he says, since the Torah says, I brought it in source number 9, Uleman tesaper beoznei vincha uven bincha es asher hisalalti b'mitzrayim ves ososai asher samti vam, you shall tell in the ears of your children, your grandchildren, that which I did to Egypt, and the signs, that's what you're meant to retell, that's what the Rambam counts, and therefore the Rambam says, it's only what I did to Egypt. In Egypt, it's only what happens in the land, not what happens at the sea. And therefore the Rambam omits this section, which is about what happened at Yam Suf. The Rambam omits it because it's not about what happened in Egypt.
Can I just ask one question though?
Yeah.
So why do the Midrash and the other rabbis feel we have to even give them, the Egyptians, more punishment than what the Torah is telling us literally in
right.
Pshat that they received.
So it's not. What it's telling, but it's not. That's what I'm saying. What well, there are two levels to this answer. But first of all, it's not that it's more punishment; it's different punishment. They're not saying that each plague was now 4 times worse, but we're not. What we're saying is that each one was 4 different things, each one tailored for the person. That 250 means that there were 250 different ways in which God deals with the Egyptians, meant to address the different levels among the Egyptians themselves. Okay. It's not that they're suffering worse; it's that they're suffering differently.
Okay.
But I want to address the other question that you hint at by saying, "But this isn't pshat," but it is, and this is a key point. And Elaine went to my Living Midrash series, so she's already familiar with this point. What Midrash does is much broader than what we do when we learn. We have a problem with the way we learn. And the problem is that we tend to be focused on the text in front of us, and we don't have a broad enough knowledge to realize the other texts that interact. When I read what happens in Parshas Beshalach, I don't keep in mind the 78th chapter of Tehillim. Frankly, unless I had seen it quoted in the Haggadah, I wouldn't realize there was a 78th chapter in Tehillim. Now, if you say Tehillim, then you know the 78th chapter in Tehillim, and you know it has to do with Mitzrayim. My point is not the Tehillim per se, okay? I gave a shiur once on a Barbanel's view about why David doesn't get to build the Beis HaMikdash. And he brings in Divrei Hayamim and Shmuel and Malachim, and he says, by the way, until I actually had to work on this question of why David couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash, I never learned Divrei Hayamim. So I never actually learned it. I didn't know it. What the sages are doing in Midrash is they're not looking at what happened in Egypt in light only of Psukim in Sefer Shmot. They're looking at the account in Tehillim, and they're bothered by something that's going on in Tehillim. They're bothered by the fact that Tehillim doesn't simply say God punished them. It says he did Charon Af, and he did Evra, and he did Za'am, and he did Sarah. And they say, well, what is this list here? What is this list trying to tell me? Why do we have Evra, Za'am, and Sarah? What are these different things here? That's bothering them, number one. Number two, what's bothering them is the other pasuk we saw quoted from Tehillim, Noda Hashem Mishpat Asa, that now you could see justice. And they're bothered because that's not justice. Protecting the Jews by harming the Egyptians is not justice in and of itself. And this goes back to our question about what justice is. And they say, we need to resolve all of these different psukim. How can we read this in a way that they'll all make sense? And their way to resolve it is to grab what Tehillim Ayin Chet does, where it has different types of punishment, and to say, that's what they're doing. That's why we often misunderstand drash and say, well, they're just making it up, without realizing, no, they're drawing on more sources than you have, and you have to read them carefully in order to see it, which is why, if you go back for a second to the first side, take a look at source number 3, and you see that source number 3, which is one of those that brings this whole account that we have in the Haggadah, does not begin with psukim from Sefer Shmot at all. It begins with Tehillim Tet and Noda Hashem Mishpat Asa. That's the pasuk they're trying to deal with, that this is coming to address. That's what they're doing here. So to now go back into the Rambam, according to what we've said, this section does fit in our Haggadah. The Rambam thinks it doesn't, as Rav Shechter explained it. I believe Rav Shechter is quoting Rav Soloveitchik with that. According to him, this section doesn't belong in your Haggadah because it's about what happened at the sea. But now it's not, because what happened at the sea is a punishment for what happened in Egypt. It is an outgrowth. Remember, Abraham was promised that there's going to be justice for what happened in Egypt. That's what happens here. That's what's happening. So it may have taken place at the sea, but it's a completion of what happened in Egypt. Which makes sense when you think about it, because the Haggadah presents this without giving us any story of what happened at the sea. When you read your Haggadah and you go from Ditzach Hadash Be'achav, that acronym, right? And then suddenly you say, well, how many times did the Egyptians hit at the sea? You don't get any preface. There are no verses. You happen to know the story because you've seen the Ten Commandments. But there's no preface to say what happened, how they ended up at the sea, that the Jews were standing there, that they were scared, none of that is there, because it's not the point. The point is only, this is the coda to Egypt, to the Egypt experience. This is where everything is finally put paid. Last point. our third question that we asked. What are we meant to learn from here in terms of V'higadat levincha? What is this doing here as part of what I tell my children? So I look at this in terms of what brought the Jews to emunah, to faith. In other classes that some of you have been at, I've emphasized the point that the prophets of Israel, many of them tend to be Nevi'ei Emet, prophets of truth, who have a very hard time with God's mercy for the wicked. So Eliyahu, for example, I brought it here in source number 10, we won't read it out in the interest of time, but Eliyahu complains to God, I've been zealous for you, they are killing the prophets, they've left your covenant, and God tries to teach him a lesson and it doesn't work, and so on. Yonah, in source number 11, complains to God, I didn't want to go to Nineveh because I knew it was going to happen. You were going to be merciful, you're going to forgive them, and I don't like that. You laugh, but he's dead serious. He says he'd rather be dead than alive. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Pei Tet, talks about God going to our ancestors and saying the Jews have sinned. And the response of Avraham and of Yaakov is, well, they should be destroyed for Kiddush Hashem. If they've sinned, let them die. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, I brought you in source number 12, has Moshe coming to God saying that your patience should be for the righteous, your patience shouldn't be for the wicked. The Gemara in Pesachim describes Hosea as being of the same bent. The prophets have a very hard time with divine mercy. I used to think that was an expression of their great spiritual refinement. They have developed themselves so much that they can't relate to the sinner anymore. But the more I think about it, the more I think that that's not correct. It's a basic human trait. We seek order and justice and fairness in our world. From, as a little kid, right? That's not fair is the biggest claim you have against the world. Things have to be fair. As we grow up and realize that we don't want 100% justice for ourselves, right, we tend to mellow out a little bit. We develop gray areas. The prophet, though, doesn't seek that margin for error. The prophet retains this desire for order and for justice. And maybe that's what resonates with the Jews after 210 years of suffering in Egypt. It resonates when they see, oh, there is justice. Finally, someone's been watching and is going to do something about this. And perhaps, mind you, this is justice for the Egyptians. It doesn't address redress for the Jews who have been suffering all along. That's its own sheer. But perhaps that's the lesson for us that's going to resonate with our children when we use this in the Haggadah. On one level, the story of us leaving Egypt is God's fulfillment of a promise to bring our ancestors to Israel. Right? All an outgrowth of his promise to Abraham and Sarah. On a second level, it's God's emancipation of the Jews, saving them from slavery. But on another level, this is a story of justice, of right and wrong, of punishment for the guilty. And it's a statement that we rarely see it, but God wants justice in our world. And I think that's an important message to convey beyond Pesach, in the way that we talk about God, not just to describe God as some kind of a Santa, who's going to give you gifts, or as an invisible landlord, but as a judge motivated by a desire for justice. This is a hard thing to discuss, because inevitably the next question is, well, then where is it and why don't I see it? Realistically, you have to be prepared for that conversation also. But I think this is a part of what we're supposed to be doing when we teach our children, is to see that. So again, we come to this story in the Haggadah, this math segment, and your husband can go through the math and explain to his heart's content, or you can do it, and have them all understand this. But I think it's important to ask the question of, so what's with the numbers? What is this all about? To talk about the personalization of the punishment and the idea that God watches, and that the Jews are singularly impressed by this when they see that the punishment indeed fits the crime. I'm going to throw on a 3-second thought at the end, just because I can't not do that. When I was growing up, I grew up in New York, in Oceanside, Long Island. So my rabbi was Rabbi Benjamin Blech, who you may have heard of. So Rabbi Blech had an additional idea on this, which my father reminded me of when I told him I was going to be giving this shiur. He said that multiplying by 4 versus multiplying by 5. He talked about how 4 is Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, the 4-letter name of God, the one that we associate with mercy. Whereas 5 is Elohim, right, the 5-letter name of God, which is the name associated with justice.
Yeah.
And so he tied that into Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva and the 4-fold and the 5-fold multiplication. So I mentioned that as well as an additional avenue to explore here. Thank you very much.